Richard never thought he'd become known for solving a math problem. Growing up on a small farm in Nebraska, his days were filled with feeding chickens, fixing fences, and helping his dad with the tractor. Unlike the other kids who dreamed of escaping farm life, Richard found joy in the patterns around him, the way corn grew in perfect rows, how rain would fall in measurable cycles, and the predictable behavior of the farm animals. His parents were honest, hard-working folks who valued practical skills over book learning. "What good is algebra when the tractor breaks down?" his father would often say with a hearty laugh that bounced off the kitchen walls. His mother, though kinder about Richard's curiosity, still pushed him toward practical subjects. "Learn something that'll put food on the table," she'd advise while kneading dough for the family's dinner bread. The local school wasn't equipped for a mind like Richard's. His math teacher, Mr. Barnes, noticed how quickly Richard finished worksheets, often finding shortcuts the textbook didn't mention. "You've got something special in that head of yours," Mr. Barnes told him once, sliding an old calculus book across his desk. "But around here, being good with numbers only means you'll be the one doing the tax returns for your neighbors." Richard took the book home and hid it under his mattress, pulling it out at night with a flashlight when his parents thought he was asleep. The symbols and equations felt like old friends, comfortable and familiar even though he was seeing them for the first time. After high school, there was no money for college. His parents assumed he'd take over the family farm, but a bad drought and mounting debts forced them to sell most of their land. Richard found himself at 28, working the night shift as a security guard at Pine Creek Community College, a job that paid little but gave him plenty of quiet. Hours to think. The college wasn't much, just 3 buildings surrounding a small square of grass that the groundskeeper struggled to keep green in the harsh Nebraska weather, but it had something Richard valued more than gold: a library that stayed open all night for students cramming for exams. During his security rounds, Richard would stop by the library, nodding to the sleepy student worker at the front desk. "Just checking in," he'd say before wandering to the mathematics section. Night after night, he taught himself from whatever books he could find: algebra, geometry, calculus, and beyond. "You must really like numbers," said Lisa, the night librarian, one evening. She was older, maybe 50, with reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. "Most people avoid this section like it's filled with snakes." Richard smiled, embarrassed to be caught reading a particularly dusty book on number theory. "Just trying to keep my mind busy during the night shift." "Well, help yourself. Nobody else touches these. Some of these haven't been checked out in decades." That conversation stuck with Richard. The idea that knowledge could sit untouched, collecting dust, bothered him deeply. He started taking his job more seriously, not just as a security guard, but as a guardian of forgotten ideas. One rainy Tuesday night, while the wind howled outside and rattled the library's old windows, Richard found himself browsing a stack of mathematical journals that had been donated by a retired professor. Most were filled with articles he couldn't fully understand, but in the middle of one particularly old journal, something caught his eye: an article about the Riemann hypothesis. He'd heard of it vaguely, one of those famous unsolved problems that mathematicians had been trying to crack for over a century. The article described it as the holy grail of mathematics, and explained how it connected to the distribution of prime numbers, and those numbers that can only be divided by 1 in themselves. Richard couldn't put it down. The way the author described the problem made it sound like a puzzle, a mystery waiting to be solved. And if there was one thing Richard loved, it was solving puzzles. He grabbed a notebook from behind the security desk and began copying down the key parts of the article, along with his own thoughts. The night passed quickly, and when the morning security guard arrived to relieve him, Richard barely noticed. He tucked the notebook into his jacket pocket and walked home in the rain, his mind still swimming with numbers. His apartment was small, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom so tiny he had to step into the shower to close the door. But the walls were perfect for what he needed. He cleared off the few family photos and the calendar from the farm supply store, replacing them with pages torn from his notebook. Soon, equations and diagrams covered the wall above his bed. Each night before his shift, he would stare at the wall, thinking about the problem. During work, he'd patrol the empty hallways of the community college, his mind still working on the equations. And after his shift, he'd add new ideas to his growing collection of notes. His few friends stopped calling after a while. "You've gotten weird, Rich," his buddy Tom said after Richard turned down poker night for the third time. "It's like you're obsessed with something." He was right. Richard was obsessed. The Riemann hypothesis had taken hold of him in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't just the challenge, though that was certainly part of it. It was the feeling that he was seeing connections no one else had spotted before. Months passed. Winter turned to spring and spring to summer. Richard's wall became a mess of papers, sticky notes, and strings connecting different ideas. He started buying math books with his meager paycheck, building a small library of his own. On his days off, he'd sometimes drive to the state university 2 hours away, slipping into the back of lecture halls to listen to mathematics professors. He didn't understand everything they said, but each visit gave him new tools to work with, new ways of thinking about his problem. One day, while cleaning out an old storage closet at the college as part of his security duties, Richard found a box of discarded supplies from the art department. Inside were colored yarns, pins, and cardboard sheets. An idea struck him. That night, he began building a 3-dimensional model of what he called prime number pathways, a physical representation of the patterns he was seeing in his equations. His landlord, Mrs. Chen, noticed the change in her quiet tenant when she came to fix his leaky sink. "You're either a genius or you've lost your mind," she said, looking at the walls covered in papers and the strange yarn structures hanging from the ceiling. "Maybe both," Richard just smiled. "I'm trying to solve a puzzle, Mrs. Chen, a really big puzzle." "Well, don't solve it too loudly. The neighbors already think you're strange. People in town started talking about that Thompson boy who'd gone funny in the head. Some said he was building bomb plans on his walls. Others thought he was tracking alien signals. His parents, during their monthly phone calls, worried he was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe you should come home for a while," his mother suggested. "Get some fresh air, help your dad with the new tractor." "I'm fine, Mom," Richard assured her. "I'm just working on something important." "More important than your health? Than your family?" He couldn't explain why it mattered so much. How could he tell his practical, down-to-earth parents that he was trying to solve one of the greatest mathematical mysteries in the world? They would think he'd truly lost his mind. The breakthrough came on an ordinary Thursday. Richard was standing in the shower, letting the hot water run over his head, thinking about a particular equation that had been troubling him for weeks. Suddenly, he saw it. A connection between two ideas that he'd been treating as separate. He shut off the water, grabbed a towel, and rushed to his wall of equations, not even bothering to dry off completely. For the next 48 hours, he didn't sleep. He worked feverishly, filling notebook after notebook with calculations, cross-checking his work, looking for flaws in his reasoning. By Saturday morning, he was exhausted but exhilarated. He believed he had found a new approach to the Riemann hypothesis. Not a complete solution yet, but a path that no one else had taken. He needed someone to look at his work, someone who could understand what he'd done. But who? The mathematics department at Pine Creek Community College consisted of 2 adjunct professors who taught basic algebra and statistics. Then he remembered Mrs. Whitney, his high school math teacher who had retired a few years back. She had always encouraged his interest in mathematics, even when others dismissed it. He found her address in the phone book and drove to her small house on the edge of town. Mrs. Whitney, now in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that still sparkled with intelligence, invited him in for tea. She listened patiently as Richard explained his work, nodding occasionally, asking sharp questions that showed she was following his logic. "You might be onto something remarkable, Richard," she said, finally setting down her teacup. "But I'm not equipped to evaluate work at this level. You need to show this to real mathematicians, experts in the field." "How would someone like me even get their attention?" Richard asked. "I'm just a night security guard from nowhere." Mrs. Whitney smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. "Let me make a phone call. I have a friend. We went to college together many years ago. He's a professor now at a big university. If I ask, he'll at least look at your work." Richard left her house with a glimmer of hope. For the first time, someone else believed that what he was doing might actually matter. As he drove back to his apartment, the setting sun painted the Nebraska sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. He couldn't help but feel that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly predict. Richard's apartment had transformed into something that would make perfect sense to him but looked like beautiful madness to anyone else. Every inch of wall space was covered with equations, diagrams, and sticky notes. From the ceiling hung his homemade models, those strange three-dimensional structures made of cardboard yarn, and pushpins that mapped what he called his prime number pathways. His neighbors had grown used to the light in his window burning until dawn. The old lady next door would sometimes bring him soup, knocking gently before setting it outside his door when he failed to answer. "You need to eat something besides numbers," she'd call through the door. Richard would find the soup later, usually cold, and feel a pang of guilt for becoming so absorbed in his work that he forgot about the world around him. Mrs. Whitney, true to her word, had contacted her old college friend, Dr. Howard Lewis, a professor of mathematics at the State University. 3 days after Richard's visit, his phone rang. "Is this Richard Thompson?" The voice was deep with a slight accent Richard couldn't place. "Yes, that's me. My name is Howard Lewis. Eleanor Whitney suggested I give you a call. She tells me you've been working on the Riemann hypothesis." There was something in the tone, a mixture of politeness and skepticism, that made Richard's stomach tighten. He'd heard that tone before, the voice people used when humoring someone they thought was slightly unhinged. "Yes, sir. I've been exploring a new approach." "Well, I promised Eleanor I'd take a look. Can you send me what you've done so far?" Richard glanced around his apartment. His work wasn't in any state to be shared. It was sprawled across walls, hanging from ceilings, scattered through dozens of notebooks. "It might take me a few days to organize everything," he said. "No rush. Mathematics has waited over 150 years for a solution to the Riemann hypothesis. It can wait a few more days." After hanging up, Richard went to the store and bought a fresh notebook and a new pen. For the next week, he barely slept, working to distill his sprawling ideas into a coherent paper. It wasn't easy. His approach didn't follow standard mathematical notation, and he struggled to translate his visual understanding into the formal language that academics would expect. By the time he finished, his paper was 63 pages long, filled with equations, diagrams, and explanations. He didn't own a computer, so he had to borrow one from the community college library to type it up. Lisa, the night librarian, let him use the staff computer after hours. "This must be important," she said, watching him hunt and peck at the keyboard. "I've never seen anyone so focused." "It might be nothing," Richard admitted. "Just the crazy ideas of a security guard who thinks too much. Or it might change everything," she countered with a kind smile. "You never know until you try." When he finally mailed his paper to Dr. Lewis, Richard felt both relief and terror. For months, his ideas had been safe inside his head and on his walls, protected from criticism. Now they would be exposed, examined, judged. Waiting for a response was agony. Richard continued his security rounds at the college, but his mind was elsewhere. He checked his mailbox daily, jumped whenever his phone rang. 2 weeks passed with no word. Then 3. By the 4th week, Richard had convinced himself that Dr. Lewis had thrown his paper away without reading it. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, his phone rang. "Richard, Howard Lewis here." The professor's voice was different now. There was an energy to it that hadn't been there before. "I've spent the last month with your paper. I've read it, reread it, and discussed sections with colleagues. I have to say, your approach is unusual." Richard's heart sank. Unusual in academia usually meant wrong or not worth pursuing. "But," Dr. Lewis continued, "there's something here. Your visualization method, especially the way you're mapping prime number distributions through three-dimensional space. I've never seen anything quite like it. It's unorthodox, certainly. Some of my colleagues think it's nonsense, but I see potential." Richard found himself gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You think I might be onto something? I think you've found a path worth exploring. Would you be willing to come to the university and discuss this further? Perhaps bring some of your models?" 2 days later, Richard loaded his cardboard and yarn structures into the back of his rusty pickup truck and drove the 2 hours to the State University. The campus intimidated him. Grand buildings with columns, students carrying expensive laptops, professors in tweed jackets discussing ideas he could barely understand. He felt out of place in his worn jeans and faded flannel shirt. Dr. Lewis met him outside the mathematics building, a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes behind round glasses. He helped Richard carry his strange models to a small conference room where 3 other professors waited. They introduced themselves, but Richard immediately forgot their names. too nervous to process anything but the critical looks they gave his handmade models. "Perhaps you could walk us through your approach," Dr. Lewis suggested, gesturing to the models now arranged on the conference table. Richard took a deep breath. These people had studied mathematics their entire lives at prestigious institutions. He was a farm boy with a high school diploma who worked as a night security guard. But when he looked at his models, the physical manifestation of the patterns he'd seen in his mind, his nervousness faded. The traditional approach to the Riemann hypothesis focuses on the zeros of the zeta function, he began, pointing to one of his yarn structures. But I started thinking about it differently. What if we visualize prime numbers not as points on a line but as a landscape, hills and valleys that follow certain patterns? For the next 2 hours, Richard explained his method, showing how his models represented mathematical relationships that were difficult to express in standard notation. The professors interrupted frequently with questions, some skeptical, others genuinely curious. "Where did you learn this approach?" one professor asked, adjusting her glasses as she leaned in to examine a particularly complex model. "I didn't," Richard admitted. "I didn't learn it anywhere. I just saw it this way." "That's impossible," another professor muttered. "No one just sees solutions to the Riemann hypothesis." "Actually," Dr. Lewis interjected, "many mathematical breakthroughs have come from unusual visualizations." Ramanujan claimed his insights came to him in dreams from a Hindu goddess. By the end of the meeting, the room had divided. 2 professors dismissed Richard's work as the interesting but ultimately misguided efforts of an amateur. The third remained quiet, neither supporting nor rejecting what she'd seen. Only Dr. Lewis seemed genuinely excited. "You need resources," he told Richard as they packed up the models. "Access to the latest research, computing power, colleagues to bounce ideas off." "I don't have those things," Richard said simply. "No, but I do." Dr. Lewis handed him a small key. "This opens my office. I'm on sabbatical next semester, going to a conference in Europe. My office is yours if you want it. The computer, the books, everything. Use it to develop your ideas further." Richard stared at the key in disbelief. "Why would you do this for me?" Dr. Lewis smiled. "Because in 40 years of teaching mathematics, I've learned to recognize when someone is seeing patterns that others miss. Your approach may not work. Most new approaches don't. But it deserves a chance." Richard took a leave of absence from his security job, explaining to his supervisor that he needed time for a personal project. The supervisor, who had always found Richard strange but reliable, agreed to hold his position for 3 months. Dr. Lewis's office became Richard's new home. He slept on a small cot in the corner, worked on the professor's computer during the day, and spread his models across the bookshelves and desk. The university janitor, an older man named Pete who cleaned the building at night, would sometimes stop to chat. "You must be pretty smart to be working in a professor's office," Pete said one evening as he emptied the trash can. Richard looked up from the computer where he was running simulations. "Not smart, just stubborn," Pete laughed. "Sometimes that's better than smart. Smart people give up when things get hard. Stubborn people keep going." The semester passed in a blur of equations, computer models, and late-night breakthroughs. Richard refined his approach, addressing the weaknesses that the skeptical professors had pointed out. He learned to use mathematical software that could compute in seconds what would have taken him weeks by hand. He devoured books from Dr. Lewis's shelves, filling gaps in his self-taught knowledge. Occasionally, he would call Mrs. Whitney to update her on his progress. "I'm starting to believe this might actually work," he told her one evening. "I never doubted it," she replied. "You always saw patterns others missed. Remember in 10th grade when you found that shortcut for solving quadratic equations? The other kids thought you were cheating." When Dr. Lewis returned from Europe, he was amazed at Richard's progress. "You've taken the seed of an idea and grown it into something substantial," he said as Richard walked him through the latest versions of his models. Now digital simulations that spun and moved on the computer screen. "It still isn't a complete proof," Richard admitted. "There are gaps, especially in section 4 where I connect the visual model back to the analytical form." "But you're closer than anyone has gotten in decades," Dr. Lewis pointed out. "I think it's time to share your work more broadly." With Dr. Lewis's help, Richard prepared a paper for submission to the Journal of Advanced Mathematical Theory, one of the most prestigious mathematics journals in the world. The paper, titled A Visual Approach to the Riemann Hypothesis, Prime Number Landscapes in Zeta Function Topography, represented months of work, thousands of calculations, and a completely new way of looking at a 150-year-old problem. They submitted the paper in early spring. Richard returned to his security job, picking up extra shifts to make up for the money he'd lost during his leave. His apartment walls, once covered in equations, now featured printouts of the computer models he'd developed. The handmade yarn structures had been replaced by more precise 3D printed models that Dr. Lewis had helped him create. "So you're back to guarding empty hallways," Lisa, the librarian, said when she saw Richard on his first night back. "After all that math stuff." "The math isn't done," Richard told her. "It's just waiting for the next step." 6 months passed with no word from the journal. Richard tried to put it out of his mind, focusing on his job and starting to think about what he might do next. Maybe community college classes? Dr. Lewis had suggested he could apply for a scholarship based on his work, even without formal qualifications. Then on a crisp fall morning, Richard checked his mail to find a thick envelope from the Journal of Advanced Mathematical Theory. His hands shook as he tore it open. Inside was his paper, all 47 pages, and a brief letter from the editor. "After careful review by our editorial board, we regret to inform you that your paper does not meet the standards for publication in our journal. While your approach is creative, it lacks the rigorous methodology and formal proofs that are the hallmark of serious mathematical work. Furthermore, several reviewers noted fundamental misunderstandings of established principles in your analysis. We encourage you to seek mentorship from established mathematicians before attempting further work in this area." Richard read the letter 3 times, each reading more painful than the last. He had expected criticism, even rejection, but not dismissal, not being treated as if he were a child playing with concepts beyond his understanding. He called Dr. Lewis, who was equally shocked. "This isn't right," the professor insisted after hearing the rejection. "Your work deserves better consideration than this. Let me make some calls." For days, Richard barely left his apartment. The rejection felt like confirmation of what he'd always feared, that he was just a farm boy playing at being a mathematician, that his lack of formal education made his ideas worthless in the eyes of the academic establishment. Then, a week after the rejection, Dr. Lewis called again. "Don't give up," he said firmly. "I've been talking to colleagues at other institutions. Several are interested in your approach. One in particular, Dr. Beth Chen at MIT, has asked to see your models. She's doing work that might complement yours." "Why would someone at MIT care about my rejected ideas?" Richard asked. "Because real mathematicians care about good ideas regardless of where they come from. Pack up your best models. We're going to Boston." Richard had never been on a plane before. The idea of flying to Boston made his stomach twist into knots, but not nearly as much as the thought of presenting his work at MIT, a place he'd only read about in magazines and newspapers. Dr. Lewis had arranged everything: the flights, a small hotel near campus, and most importantly, a meeting with Dr. Beth Chen, a rising star in the field of analytical number theory. "Just be yourself," Dr. Lewis advised as they waited at the gate. "Don't try to use fancy words or pretend you know things you don't. What makes your approach valuable is precisely that it's different, that you've come at this problem from outside the traditional framework." Richard nodded, clutching the carry-on bag that contained his most important models. He'd spent the previous week refining them, making sure they were as clear and precise as possible. Still, compared to the sleek computer-generated models he imagined MIT mathematicians used, his cardboard and yarn creations seemed childish. The flight was turbulent, matching Richard's nerves. Looking out the window at the patchwork of farmland below, he couldn't help but think about how far he was from where he'd started. Not just physically, but in every other way. 3 years ago, he'd been a night security guard with a high school diploma and a strange fascination with numbers. Now he was flying across the country to discuss his approach to one of mathematics' greatest unsolved problems with professors at MIT. Boston overwhelmed him. The noise, the crowds, the pace of life so different from his small Nebraska town. The cab ride from the airport to their hotel passed in a blur of tall buildings and unfamiliar streets. Richard barely slept that night, rehearsing his explanation over and over in his mind. The MIT campus was both impressive and intimidating. Grand buildings of brick and stone housed some of the greatest minds in the world. Students hurried past, deep in conversation about concepts Richard could only guess at. Dr. Lewis led him through the maze of buildings to the mathematics department. Dr. Chen's office was surprisingly modest. A small room, lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets, papers stacked in organized chaos on every surface. Dr. Chen herself defied Richard's expectations. He'd imagined someone older, imposing, perhaps a bit intimidating. Instead, she was a woman in her early 40s with a quick smile and energetic movements, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "You must be Richard," she said, extending her hand. "Howard has told me so much about your work. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Richard shook her hand, managing a nervous smile. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Dr. Chen. I know you must be very busy." "Beth, please." "And yes, I'm busy, we all are, but never too busy for new ideas." She gestured to a small conference table in the corner of her office. "Show me what you've brought." With trembling hands, Richard unpacked his models, setting them up on the table. Dr. Chen watched with interest, occasionally asking questions about how certain pieces connected or what specific patterns represented. Unlike the skeptical professors at the state university, she didn't dismiss his approach outright. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious, examining the models from different angles, sometimes closing her eyes as if visualizing the mathematical relationships they represented. "I've seen your paper," she said finally, sitting back. "Howard sent it to me last week. I understand why the journal rejected it. It doesn't follow the standard format. The notation is unconventional, and it makes leaps that aren't fully explained. But there's something here that most reviewers probably missed." Richard leaned forward. "What's that?" "A fresh perspective." She pointed to one of his models, a particularly complex structure that represented the relationship between prime numbers and the zeros of the Riemann zeta function. This visualization approach, it's not how most mathematicians would tackle the problem, but sometimes that's exactly what we need. The history of mathematics is full of outsiders who saw what the experts couldn't, precisely because they weren't constrained by conventional thinking. For the next 3 hours, they talked. Dr. Chen asked penetrating questions that forced Richard to articulate ideas he'd previously only understood intuitively. She suggested refinements, pointed out weaknesses, and occasionally scribbled notes and equations on a legal pad. Dr. Lewis contributed occasionally, but mostly observed, a slight smile on his face as he watched his protege hold his own with one of the field's brightest minds. "Here's what I think," Dr. Chen said finally, tapping her pen against her notepad. "Your approach has genuine merit, but it needs development. The way you visualized prime number distributions is particularly interesting. It aligns with some recent work on pattern recognition in seemingly random sequences." Richard nodded, encouraged by her words but still unsure where this left him. "I'd like to assemble a small team to work with you," Dr. Chen continued. "Not to take over your research, but to help formalize it. To bridge the gap between your visual understanding and the rigorous proofs that mathematics requires." "A team?" Richard echoed, surprised. 3 or 4 people with complementary skills. A computational specialist, certainly. Someone with a background in topology. Perhaps a statistician. She smiled at his expression. "Does that surprise you?" I didn't expect anyone to take my work this seriously. Especially after the journal rejection." Dr. Chen waved a hand dismissively. "Journals can be conservative. They prefer incremental advances within established frameworks. Revolutionary ideas often face initial resistance." She leaned forward. "Richard, I don't know if your approach will ultimately lead to a proof of the Riemann hypothesis. Most attempts fail. That's the nature of difficult problems. But your visualization method could advance our understanding regardless. And that's worth pursuing." As they left her office, Richard felt lightheaded with relief and excitement. Dr. Lewis clapped him on the shoulder. "I told you she'd see the potential." "What happens now?" Richard asked. "Now we start assembling the team Beth mentioned. It will take time, funding, arrangements. But the important thing is that your work has found a champion. Someone with the influence and resources to help develop it properly." Over dinner that evening at a small restaurant near their hotel, Richard and Dr. Lewis discussed next steps. The professor suggested that Richard apply for a research position at the state university, not as a student, but as a special research associate. It wouldn't pay much, he admitted, but it would give you institutional support and access to resources. Richard pushed his food around his plate, thinking, I'd have to leave my job, my apartment. Yes, it would be a big change. Dr. Lewis studied him across the table. Are you having doubts? No, not about the work, just this all seems unreal. 3 days ago I was checking door locks at a community college. Now I'm being offered a research position and a team at MIT is interested in my ideas. That's how breakthroughs happen sometimes. Suddenly, unexpectedly. The question is whether you're ready to follow where this leads. Richard looked out the restaurant window at the unfamiliar city streets. I've been ready my whole life. I just never thought I'd get the chance. Back in Nebraska, Richard gave notice at his security job. His supervisor seemed genuinely sorry to see him go. You were always reliable, he said, shaking Richard's hand. Whatever this new opportunity is, I hope it works out for you. Packing up his apartment took less time than Richard expected. Most of his possessions were books and his mathematical models. His few clothes fit into a single suitcase. Mrs. Chen, his landlady, refused to take his last month's rent. You use that money for your big university job, she insisted. Just don't forget us small people when you become famous. The research position at the state university came with a small office, nothing fancy, but a place Richard could call his own. The university administration had been skeptical about hiring someone without formal qualifications, but Dr. Lewis had vouched for him, and Richard's meeting with Dr. Chen at MIT carried unexpected weight. Within a month, Dr. Chen had assembled the team she'd promised. They met weekly via video conference, Richard and Dr. Lewis at the State University, Dr. Chen and 3 colleagues at MIT, and occasionally other mathematicians who joined out of curiosity or interest. The first few meetings were difficult. Richard struggled to explain his intuitive understanding in terms the team could work with. The MIT mathematicians, brilliant in their fields, sometimes had trouble grasping Richard's unconventional approach. There were moments of frustration on both sides. It's like we're speaking different languages, Richard complained to Dr. Lewis after a particularly challenging session. You are, in a way, the professor agreed. They've spent years learning a very precise mathematical language. You've developed your own visual language to understand the same concepts. The challenge is finding a translation that works for everyone. Slowly, painfully, they began to make progress. Dr. Chen's computational specialist, a young woman named Lin who spoke so quickly, Richard sometimes had to ask her to repeat herself, developed algorithms to test Richard's visual models against known prime number distributions. The results were encouraging. His models predicted patterns that aligned with established data. The topologist, an older man named Dr. Victor Patel who had been studying mathematical shapes for 40 years, helped Richard formalize the geometric aspects of his approach. What you're describing, he said during one session, his voice crackling through the video link, is essentially a topological manifold with unique properties. Your intuition led you there, but we can describe it with existing mathematical tools. Richard spent 18-hour days in his office, working to bridge the gap between his visual understanding and the formal mathematics his team needed. He learned new notation, absorbed concepts he'd never encountered in his self-teaching, and gradually developed the ability to translate between his way of seeing the problem and the language of academic mathematics. 3 months into the collaboration, they had enough progress to justify a more formal paper. This time, Dr. Chen took the lead on writing it, with Richard and the team as co-authors. The paper, titled Novel Topological Approaches to Prime Number Distribution and the Riemann Hypothesis, was more technically rigorous than Richard's original submission, while still preserving the core of his visual approach. They submitted it to a different journal, one known for being more open to unconventional methods. 6 weeks later, it was accepted with minor revisions. Richard's name appeared in print alongside respected mathematicians from MIT and the State University. The publication opened doors. Other mathematicians began to take notice of the unusual collaboration between an untrained former security guard and established academics. Some remained skeptical, but others were intrigued enough to reach out, offering suggestions or asking questions about specific aspects of their approach. Richard started receiving invitations to speak at mathematics departments around the country. His first talk at a small college in Michigan was a nervous disaster. He spoke too quickly, used terminology inconsistently, and stumbled through his explanation of the visual models. But with each presentation, he grew more confident, more articulate. Dr. Lewis attended most of these talks, offering support and guidance. After a particularly successful presentation at the University of Chicago, where Richard had handled complex questions with surprising ease, the professor took him out for dinner to celebrate. "You've come a long way," Dr. Lewis said, raising his glass in a toast, from security guard to giving lectures at major universities in less than a year. Richard smiled, but there was a hint of weariness in it. "Sometimes I feel like an imposter. Like everyone's waiting for me to make a mistake that proves I don't belong in this world. That's called imposter syndrome, and most academics feel it at some point. The difference is they've had years of formal training to build their confidence. You've had to learn everything on the fly in public view. Do you ever wonder if we're wasting our time?" Richard asked, voicing a fear he rarely admitted even to himself. "If this approach will ultimately fail like all the others?" Dr. Lewis considered the question seriously. "Science isn't just about finding the answer. It's about exploring new paths, developing new tools. Even if your approach doesn't lead directly to a proof of the Riemann hypothesis, it's already contributing to our understanding. The visualization methods you've developed have applications beyond this specific problem." As they walked back to their hotel, Dr. Lewis's phone rang. It was Dr. Chen calling from MIT. Richard could hear only one side of the conversation, but he could tell from Dr. Lewis's expression that something significant had happened. "What is it?" Richard asked when the call ended. Dr. Lewis looked both excited and slightly stunned. "That was Beth. The algorithms Lynn developed based on your models, they've found something unexpected. A pattern in the distribution of large prime numbers that wasn't predicted by existing theories, but aligns perfectly with your visual approach." "Is that good?" "Richard," Dr. Lewis said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's extraordinary. It suggests your intuition about the underlying structure might be correct in ways we haven't fully appreciated yet." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced his hotel room thinking about what this new discovery might mean. Was he really getting closer to solving a problem that had defeated mathematicians for over a century? Or was this just an interesting detour that would ultimately lead nowhere? As dawn broke over Chicago, Richard sat by the window watching the city come to life. Whatever happened next, he had already come further than anyone, including himself, had thought possible. A farm boy from Nebraska with no formal training had found his way into the highest levels of mathematical research. His visualization method had been published in a respected journal, and now it had predicted a pattern that no one else had seen. He was no longer just Richard Thompson, night security guard with a strange hobby. He was Richard Thompson, mathematician, a person with ideas worth listening to. Whatever doubts and challenges lay ahead, that fact alone made the journey worthwhile. The pattern discovery changed everything. Within days, mathematicians from around the world were contacting Dr. Chen's team, requesting access to their data and algorithms. The paper they'd published, which had received modest attention initially, was suddenly being downloaded thousands of times from the journal's website. Richard's visual approach, once dismissed as the interesting but ultimately misguided work of an amateur, was now at the center of intense mathematical discussion. Dr. Chen called an emergency meeting of the research team. "We need to move quickly," she said, her usual calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "Other groups will try to build on our discovery. We need to push forward with the next phase of analysis." Richard found himself working around the clock. Lynn, the computational specialist, developed more sophisticated algorithms based on his models, running them against larger and larger data sets of prime numbers. Dr. Patel refined the topological framework, connecting Richard's visual approach to established mathematical structures. 2 new team members joined, a number theorist from Germany and a specialist in complex analysis from Japan, each bringing new perspectives to the collaboration. What had started as a solo project in Richard's small apartment was now an international research effort. Weekly video conferences expanded to include mathematicians from universities across 4 continents. Richard's office walls were covered with printouts of data analyses, complex equations, and refined versions of his original models. "How are you holding up?" Dr. Lewis asked one evening, finding Richard asleep at his desk, his head resting on a pile of papers. Richard sat up, blinking away exhaustion. "There's so much happening so fast. Sometimes I can't keep up with all the technical discussions. That's normal. This is cutting-edge research now. Even people with PhDs are struggling to follow every aspect of it. The important thing is that your core insight, your way of visualizing the problem, is still driving everything forward." 6 months after the pattern discovery, they had enough new results to justify a major presentation at the International Congress of Mathematicians, the Olympic Games of the math world, held every 4 years. Dr. Chen, as the senior member of the team, would give the main presentation, but she insisted that Richard present a section on the visualization method that had started it all. The news terrified him. "I can't speak in front of hundreds of professional mathematicians," he protested. "I'm still learning the proper terminology. I'll make mistakes." "Of course you will," Dr. Chen said matter-of-factly during their video call. "Everyone does, but you understand these models better than anyone. You created them. No one can explain them as well as you can." The Congress was being held in Seoul that year. Richard had never left the United States before. The process of getting a passport, arranging flights, and preparing for an international trip added another layer of stress to his already overwhelming schedule. "Just focus on your presentation," Dr. Lewis advised. "I'll handle the travel logistics." Richard threw himself into preparation. He practiced his presentation daily, working with Dr. Lewis to refine his explanation and anticipate questions. He studied the latest results from the team, making sure he understood how his original vision had evolved through their collaborative work. He even bought a new suit, his first, for the presentation. Seoul was a shock to his system, a mega city of lights, sounds, and people that made Boston seem calm by comparison. The conference center was enormous, filled with thousands of mathematicians from around the world. Richard felt like an alien among them, acutely aware of his lack of formal credentials. The night before their presentation, he met Dr. Chen in person for the first time since their initial meeting at MIT over a year ago. She had arrived with Lin and Dr. Patel, the core members of the original team. Over dinner at a local restaurant, they discussed last-minute adjustments to their presentation. "The room will be packed tomorrow," Dr. Chen warned. "Word has spread about our results. There's significant interest and skepticism." "Skepticism?" Richard asked, his stomach tightening. "That's normal in mathematics, especially with an approach this unconventional. Some people won't believe the results until they've verified every step themselves. Others are uncomfortable with the visual nature of the method. They prefer pure analytics. And some," Dr. Patel added with a slight smile, "will be skeptical simply because of you, Richard. Because I don't have a degree? Because you've challenged the established way of thinking about one of the most famous problems in mathematics. That's threatening to people who have built careers on traditional approaches." The morning of the presentation arrived with Richard feeling physically ill from nervousness. The lecture hall was indeed packed, hundreds of mathematicians filling every seat with more standing along the walls. Richard recognized some of the most famous names in the field sitting in the front rows, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. Dr. Chen presented first, giving an overview of the project and the key results they'd achieved over the past 18 months. She was polished, articulate, handling complex material with ease. When she introduced Richard as the originator of the visualization approach that underlies our work, a murmur ran through the audience. As Richard took the podium, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely organize his notes. He looked out at the sea of faces, brilliant minds waiting to judge his work, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Then from the front row, Dr. Lewis gave him an encouraging nod. Richard took a deep breath and began. "I'm not a traditional mathematician," he started, deciding to address the elephant in the room directly. 3 years ago, I was a night security guard at a community college in Nebraska. But I've always seen numbers differently, as shapes, patterns, landscapes that can be explored." He activated the first slide, a digital version of one of his original yarn and cardboard models. "This is how I first visualized the distribution of prime numbers, not as points on a line, but as a three-dimensional topography where certain features correlate with prime number clusters. As he continued, explaining the evolution of his approach from crude physical models to sophisticated digital simulations, something unexpected happened. His nervousness faded. This wasn't about his credentials or background anymore. It was about the mathematics, the patterns and relationships he'd first glimpsed years ago in his small apartment. For 30 minutes, Richard guided the audience through his visualization method, showing how it had led to the discovery of the new pattern in large prime distributions. He used analogies and metaphors to make complex concepts accessible, occasionally smiling at the memory of his early attempts to express these ideas. When he finished and opened the floor for questions, there was a moment of silence. Then hands shot up across the room. The questions came rapid fire, some supportive, others challenging, a few openly hostile. A prominent professor from Princeton suggested that the pattern they'd discovered was merely a statistical anomaly. Another from Oxford questioned whether Richard's visual approach had any rigorous mathematical foundation. Richard handled the friendly questions easily enough, but struggled with the more technical challenges. At one point, he simply had to say, "That's a question better answered by Dr. Chen or Dr. Patel. My understanding of differential geometry isn't advanced enough yet." Some in the audience smirked at this admission, but others nodded appreciatively at his honesty. Dr. Chen stepped in smoothly to address the more technical questions, defending their methodology and results with confidence. The final question came from a small, elderly man sitting quietly in the back corner, Dr. Terence Chang, a legendary figure who had been working on the Riemann hypothesis for over 50 years. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice soft but clear, "your visualization approach is unlike anything I've seen in my long career. Most of us have been trying to solve this problem using increasingly complex analytics. You've taken us back to geometry, to shapes and forms. My question is simple. What made you think this was the right path when so many brilliant minds have failed using conventional methods?" The room fell silent. It was the question at the heart of everything. Why should this untrained former security guard succeed where generations of mathematical geniuses had failed? Richard thought for a moment before answering. "I didn't know it was the wrong path," he said finally. "I didn't know that visualization wasn't how mathematicians usually approach these problems. I just knew that when I looked at prime numbers, I saw landscapes, not isolated points. I followed what I could see, not what I had been taught to look for." After the presentation, Richard was surrounded by mathematicians wanting to discuss specific aspects of his approach. Some were skeptical but curious, others excited by the possibilities. A few were openly dismissive, walking away with comments about amateur hour and mathematical tourism. Dr. Chang, the elderly mathematician who had asked the final question, made his way slowly through the crowd until he stood face to face with Richard. "You have done something remarkable," he said quietly. "Not because you've solved the problem. You haven't, at least not yet, but because you've reminded us that sometimes fresh eyes see what experienced ones cannot." The presentation at the Congress marked a turning point. The team's work was now firmly in the mathematical spotlight, subject to intense scrutiny from experts worldwide. This brought new challenges. Other research groups began publishing papers building on their approach, sometimes challenging their conclusions or proposing alternative interpretations of the data.